Hello everyone. In this video, we will be introduced to the concepts of basic 3D geometry in After Effects. As I have mentioned before, 3D geometry can be created in After Effects by using information contained within shape layers, text layers, or any layer that contains vector information that has been imported into After Effects. So if you're using SVG files or AI files, they contain vector information that can be translated into into shape layers. Now, this vector information is within the file that you import. So as you can see on the screen right now, I have 4 layers that were imported from Illustrator, and they're all vector-based. So what I want to do to turn those layers into shapes, what I want to do is I want to select the layers, and then I can go under Layer, Create Shape Layers from Vector Layer. You can also right-click any of the layers, and from the flyout menu, go to Create Shape Layers from Vector Layer. So when I do that, you will notice that the program retraced the vector information in the composition, and basically the artwork didn't seem to have changed, but it did actually turn off all of the Illustrator layers and turned on copies, retrace copies based on shape layers. So what I want to do at this point is I want to select all the Illustrator layers and delete them. I only needed them to bring the artwork into After Effects. Now with that done, what I want to do is I want to go ahead and make sure that I can turn them into 3D layers and create 3D geometry with them. But before we do that, I want to do a couple of changes. I want to create a hole in that circle where that H happens to be. So how do I use that path information to cut the path from the previous path, from the circle path? Well, in order to do that, I need to dig into the H outlines layer, go into its contents, and notice that there's a group, and it contains a path, which is the actual outline shape of the H, and the fill color, which is what fills that particular path. I only need the path information in this case. So I'm going to go ahead and select the path label right here, and I'm going to select the actual path, and I'm going to copy it. Control-C on the keyboard, or Command-C. Then I'm going to go to the Circle Outlines layer, uncollapse all the way till I get to the group that contains the path for the circle, and with the group selected, I am going to paste the path. Control-V. Now you notice that the H got pasted, but it's off-center. It's not exactly where I expected it to be. And the reason for that is because that layer, the original layer, has its own set of coordinates as to where the H was based on the 0, 0 point for that particular layer. Well, those don't match the ones from the circle. So it places it based on the difference in position between those two layers. But nothing to worry about. I can always select the path independently by clicking on it here on the actual create outline. So if I go and click on the path, I have selected only the H path. And if I double click it in my composition window, you'll notice that I get the transform window, the transform handles around that path. And that means I can go ahead and move it by dragging it. And I can then fine tune this to place it on top of the other H by using my arrow keys on my keyboard if I want to move 1 pixel at a time. If I want to move more than 1 pixel, say 5 or 10 pixels at a time, I can press the modifier key Shift and keep it pressed while I press the arrow keys to move with the arrows but at a faster pace. So you can go ahead and do that. Now that that outline has been placed there, what I want to do is I want to turn off the visibility of the H outlines layer. So if I turn the visibility of that off, I see now that my 2 paths here in this circle's outline basically are one within the other. There's 2 paths inside that particular shape. Now, when I move this path on top of the right underneath path 2, watch what happens. I'm going to select that path 2, move it under path 1, and it seems to have cut a hole in it. Well, this layer is a 2D layer. So as of now, they're acting like 2D layers. Everything is acting like a 2D layer. So let me go ahead and turn on 3D for everything. As soon as I turn on 3D, you notice that the H got filled again. So it didn't really cut a hole in it. It just is simply placed there. What I want to do at this point is I want to take advantage of that merge paths option that I have under my components for the shape layers. So I'm going to go in there and I'm going to choose merge paths. And when I do that, basically I have the option under merge paths to select the mode in which these 2 objects create that Boolean operation, whether I want to add them or if I want to subtract them or intersect or whatever I want. So basically, this is the same thing as pathfinding in Illustrator. So if I say subtract, whatever happens to be below is going to be subtracting from whatever happens to be above. And so it's going to say, okay, so I need to subtract that path 2 from path 1. And that's what it did. It took out the H away from the circle, basically cutting a hole, a stencil hole inside in it. So that created the hole in that particular layer. Now with that done, this is basically all 3D now. These are all 3D geometry. So how do we know that they're 3D geometry? Well, let's go ahead and look into their geometry options. If I expand that, you'll notice that now I have the ability to create extrusions. So if I go ahead and say I want to extrude this to about 50 pixels, I really don't see much of a difference. I only start seeing a difference when I actually rotate this thing or change the viewport viewpoint from which I am looking at my composition. So you notice that when I switch my view to custom view 1, that bird's eye view, I see that there's some kind of extrusion. There's volume on that circle, but I don't really see anything here because there's no lights. And if there's no lights, there's no actual light creating the dark and light values, as I explained in the previous video. So the program decides to make everything the same amount of light everywhere, making everything look flat. So just a quick drop of a light, I'm going to use a point light, and I'm going to make it about 250 percentage in power. Let me go ahead and move this light around, and you start seeing that there's some kind of beveling or cut inside the actual logo. Now, this is a fairly dark shape, as you saw when we started. Let's take a look at this from the active camera. You notice that it's a dark gray. Let me turn off the point light so you can see how dark it is. Let me go ahead and change the fill color for that circle. So I'm just going to go ahead and go into its contents, fill, and I'm going to change that fill color. I'm going to make it white in this case so that we actually can see a little bit more of the actual beveling that we have created, or the actual extrusion. So let me go ahead and switch back to my custom view 1, and now you can see a little bit better that there's some kind of depth around it. So let me go ahead and turn on that light, and you'll see it a little bit more in detail. Let me bring that up, and you should start seeing some of the edge beveling right here. Okay. Now, it still looks pretty dark if you ask me. As you can see, even as I am on top of it, I don't see that white. I mean, the light is almost on top of it. So why is that edge not white? Well, besides it having a fill color, my group also contains a stroke. And the stroke is probably a dark color. And there it is. See, that stroke is dark. So for now, I'm simply going to turn off the stroke in that shape. And you'll notice that it automatically goes to that bright white material that I had applied to or the color that I had applied to the fill. Now you see that there's some kind of extrusion. Now this is 3D extrusion, nothing new. Where this gets interesting is when we remove this light, for example, everything goes flat, and then we make use of what we call environmental layers. Now, an environmental layer is a layer that allows you to apply a light onto the scene based on an image. What does that mean? Well, for this, we need images that contain a lot of information, 8K images or something like that, what we call HDRI images, high range, high dynamic range images. Do a search for HDRI images on the web and you'll find out what they are. You have seen them in the past. Most of them are shot in 360 mode so that you actually can use them as environment layers in 3D programs. In this case, I have this image here of a parking lot, and it is an HDRI image. So I'm going to drop it in, and you'll notice that basically it's just a regular image to the eye, but if I open it up in its preview window, you'll notice the distortion. That means it is a 360 HDRI image, meaning it contains all that information. It contains all the information for me to, if I were to map this to a sphere, it would look like I am sitting in the middle of that parking lot. And that's exactly what we're going to try to do. So the first thing we're going to do is turn that image into an environment layer. So doing this increases the rendering time on your program 100-fold. It automatically slows down everything because you're now approaching true 3D environments as if you were in a 3D program. So you do that. You turn that layer into an environment layer by going under Layer, Environment Layer, or right-clicking and choosing Environment Layer. Either one of the two is going to work. There it is. So if I select that, notice what happens. The visibility of that layer goes away. And nothing appears to happen. I don't happen to see anything change other than the layer disappear. Let me go ahead and create a camera. And I'm going to create a 2-node camera, and I'm going to simply place it there. Boom. Now this camera is, I believe I have it at 15. Do I have it at 15? Let me see. Let me undo that. Yes, 15 millimeter. Let me make it 24 millimeter so that I don't exaggerate the distortion too much. And let me go ahead and press the C key on my keyboard to call the orbit tool. And I'm going to orbit this. And you notice that this is lagging a little bit. Now it starts lagging when I'm doing the changes because it is trying to calculate a bunch of stuff at the same time. What bunch of stuff is it that it's trying to calculate? Well, let's look at the circle outlines layer. Let's look at its material options. And now remember, we're working with the Cinema 4D renderer. Therefore, we have access to all of the different things that come with that renderer based on the material options for the object. So let's say, for example, I want to increase the reflectivity of this material. Well, right now reflection intensity is at 0%. Let me make that about 75%. You will notice that this material starts reflecting the environment layer that we had created. So that layer becomes the light that is lighting this particular object in 3D space. Okay, so let me move it this way, and you'll notice that the reflections change as I rotate or orbit around the object. Okay, now let me go ahead and bring that down a bit because it's completely reflective right now. Let me go ahead and change the reflection sharpness from 100% to about 80% so that it gets a little blurry. So I get a little bit more of a blurry feel. So it is still shiny and sharp, but it's not as reflective as a mirror as it was a second ago. Let me also move the change, for example, the ambient color. So if I'm going to change the ambient color to 0, this should get darker. And it does because it's not reflecting any of the ambient light that is being projected by that image. It's simply picking up the chrominance value of that image, meaning the color. It's not picking the light. If I increase the ambient color, it's also picking, besides the colors, it's also picking the lightness of the image. So this sunlight that is in the image, because this is an HDRI image, is actually creating light in my composition. So this is really cool because I can actually make reflections based on real world images inside my materials in the actual scene. Now you can also change the intensity and shininess of the intensity of the specular, which is the highlights. You can make them brighter, or you can make them completely dull. It's completely up to how you want to handle that. And it changes depending on the shape of the object and all the way that the material reflects your light. You can also change the shininess. You can change the metalness of the object. I mean, all of these are key settings that you can play with. And as you can see, there's not much change because the reflectivity is so intense that it's actually affecting it's overwhelming everything else. So that's why you don't see too much of a change. But remember, metal value, if you go all the way to 100%, you're approaching the material to look like metal. But if you go towards 0%, the material starts to look like rubber. So that is basically this percentage indicates. The lower, the more rubbery the material will look. The higher, the more metal-like it's going to look. All right? And you can also change the roll-off of this if you want to. Now that actually does affect the reflectivity. So you can go ahead and play around until you get the material look that you want on this. Now with that done, what would be cool is if I could just go ahead and you notice that basically my environment layer disappeared. It would be great if I could bring in that environment layer again. So in the past, we used to use, like I said, the Ray Trace 3D renderer, which has been removed from the program. So the way to do this now is by placing the same image inside the composition. You notice that it's going to look like a flat image again. Let me actually turn off the visibility of the reflection and the visibility of my actually, I'm just going to turn off the visibility of the environment. I am going to then, from my filters presets, I am going to look for a filter called CC Environment. That CC Environment option, actually, I can apply to that HDRI image in the background, and that CC Environment option actually allows me to increase the lens distortion of an image to make it more distorted, or to pan, to rotate the image around if I need to. You can also choose how that image is mapped onto that filter. In our case, it's spherical because of the type of image that we're using. Remember our HDRI image is a 360 shot. What is cool about this filter, though, is that it obeys the position of my camera on the screen. So I can go ahead and switch my tool to the orbit tool, and you'll notice that my camera rotates, and I am rotating, and I'm seeing the entirety of the parking lot as if I was actually in it. So basically what it did is it created a sphere around my environment and mapped that image, that HDRI image, onto that sphere, creating therefore a scene for me, creating ambience for the scene. And this matches the environment that I created with the HDRI image. So when I turn them both on, basically I'm seeing the reflection here of whatever happens to be behind me in the camera, or behind the, basically as if I was reflecting directly on it. So right now that I'm looking straight onto this, I'm looking at the trees that are behind me on the shot. And if I were to turn around 180 degrees, I probably will see the trees back there. You see, those are the trees that I was looking at a second ago in my reflection. So it is, these trees right here. So it actually works out really well. It actually matches evenly real world position based on the actual HDRI information and how it reflects onto the object. Now, this is cool, but what would be cool is if I could animate this thing and actually create an actual rotation around this. So your first inclination would be like, well, I just saw you do a rotation with your camera, so why can't I just go ahead and call the position and rotation values for that camera and set keyframes for it? So let's go ahead and call position, and then Shift R to call rotation, set keyframes at the beginning, then move downstream to about 3 seconds, and then I'm gonna orbit around this to create that orbit, thinking that that's the way that this is gonna orbit. You will notice that when I did that, it only created a keyframe for the position, not one for the rotation. So when you use the orbit tool and the move tool and the truck tool, the dolly tool, they only create position changes. They do not create orientation changes. And even though this is a 2-node camera, what is happening is actually moving the entire camera, and it's not actually rotating, as you'll see in just a second. You see how close it got to the actual logo? That's not what my intent was. So how do I go about fixing this problem? I want to do that rotation exactly as the orbit tool is showing me that I can, like so. So how do I fix that problem? Let me turn up what delays your render, by the way, is this HDRI environment layer. Notice that when I turn it off, basically we see almost real-time rendering. So how can I create a rotation like this? Well, to create a rotation like that, I use a helper. So I'm going to go ahead and create me a null object. And with the null object, I am going to call it controller, because I like calling things controller. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make that camera a child of the controller. Now, when I rotate my controller, when I turn it into a 3D layer, if I rotate my controller, let me call the rotation value for it, I can go ahead and rotate on the y-axis by simply setting up keyframes. Let's say I'm just going to rotate it about 90 degrees so we can see the point. So if I do that, when I rotate this, you will notice that I'm now creating the arc around the logo that I intended to do. Now, this is rendering fairly fast, but it's because I don't have that HDRI image for the environment activated. Once I activate this, even if I go to a quarter of quality, let's say, which is very low, it just takes forever to render. Once we start introducing elements like this, HDRI images, and actually approaching real 3D environments inside After Effects, the rendering power of After Effects slows down. Doesn't matter how much RAM you have, it's still going to be fairly slow because it is calculating, again, it's doing two things at the same time. It's working as a 2D program for motion graphics, and it's trying to run a 3D engine at the same time. So it's going to be slow. Let me just stop it right here. I'm just going to render about 1 second worth of animation. And notice that we are at a quarter of the quality. So that is very low quality. So if I do this and I preview this back, you'll notice that the animation is there. And when I'm going to go render this, obviously I would go to full quality again, and then try to, or auto, Let's see with auto what it does. It's going to default again to full quality because it likes rendering full quality. It still sees that I have a lot of RAM in this machine. Therefore, it's going to try to render full quality. But what's going to happen is basically going to say it's going to slow down. However, it pays off when you're about to render your final project, to wait for something like this to render appropriately, to gain that quality of 3D render that you would expect from a 3D program. Let me stop this here for just a second, let it render on its own, and I'll be right back. All right, so I've decided that we're only going to render about 2 seconds worth of this so you can see what it does, and you can see the actual 3D render in action. Once again, remember that before you go to render this, if I stop this render around here, I see a lot of aliasing around the edges. So when I go to 100% on this, I'm going to see that there's a loss of quality there. So I want to go to the settings for Cinema 4D, and I want to increase these to about 3 or 4 so that I can reduce that aliasing, make it disappear, basically make it smooth. The graininess comes from my decision to make the texture, the actual material in the object, in the circle outlines, to make the material options for, where is it? Here. The sharpness to 80%. If you want it to look like it's glass, bring that up to 100%, and it's going to look like it's a reflective glass. So you control that sharpness from that point, remember that. And remember, we also have some other 3D elements in here in this composition that actually, can be interacting with that particular object. So for example, the plus outlines contents are also 3D. So I can go ahead and increase the extrusion of this. And when we extruded things in the past, it went in the back direction. What happens if I extrude? If I want to move this probably out a little bit, so let's go ahead and get the arrow tool, move this on the Z-axis a little bit to the front, and then extrude that object. You notice that it's getting reflected on the actual circle shape. So if I extrude this, then I can see that the actual extrusion is there, and it'll start interacting with the reflection on the actual circle. So I mean, this can go many places, and this is the reason why this process slows down the rendering process, because it starts trying to recalculate all this for you, and it can be very time consuming. However, the end results are really good.